Benjamin Britten was the great British classical composer of the broadcasting age. His music was regularly heard on radio and television throughout his working life.
The BBC was constantly trying to, I was going to say, court him, and in the ways we were.
An intensely private man, he did allow the camera into his world.
Even though he was involved with the televising of his works, he never owned a television himself.
In this programme, we'll see and hear some of the highlights of his broadcast legacy, meeting some of the musicians he worked with.
He was a hero amongst composers, and I hero worshipped.
Visiting the Suffolk coast, which inspired so much of his work.
This music came from deep in Ben's heart.
And hearing from the producers who brought his music to vast audiences.
The BBC were able to find ways of serving him, recognising that he was a truly great figure in our lives.
In the cold and wintry month of February 1969, a significant piece of broadcasting history was made here on the edge of the North Sea in Suffolk. The BBC had taken a bold decision to leave the comfortable, controlled environment of its London studios to film a production of Britain's majestic, dark opera Peter Grimes on location at Snape Maltings, the composer's own concert space close to his home in the seaside town of Aldborough. At Sadler's Wells in 1945, the very first production of Peter Grimes had caused a national sensation. Broadcast on BBC Radio, it brought modern opera to a whole new audience.
I had no inclination to switch off, even in the most discordant passages.
The story is grim and sordid and could hardly be called pleasant entertainment, but it's well told.
Britain has arrived with this opera.
Now, nearly 25 years later, the BBC would bring Britain's greatest operatic triumph to the nation's TV screens in full colour, with the original singer Peter Pears recreating the title role.
Picture what that day was like, that evil day. We sailed into the wind.
Peter Pears was Britain's lover and partner for most of his life. They met in the late 30s when Pears was a member of the BBC Singers, and for decades they would defy the law against homosexuality and social convention by living and working together.
And the child's silent reproach turned to menace.
Britten had composed the role of Peter Grimes specifically for Pears's distinctive tenor voice.
It was difficult with Pears being in his 60s then. You know, trying to be the young fisherman was not so easy in close-up.
With a childish death.
The major thing about it is that it's Benjamin Britten conducting and Peter Pears singing Peter Grimes. Well, you know, come on, that's already a fantastic bonus. But the cast was very strong. They had Joan Cross, the veteran director and singer herself, with Brian Large, then a very young but brilliant television director, doing it.
Ellen, give me your hand.
There was a lot to cram into the auditorium of the Maltings, not just the set, the singers and all the cameras, but a 50-piece orchestra.
Britten insisted on it being recorded in the Maltings, which was ideal in terms of sound, but not as an opera set.
And I should like to say how very proud all of us from Aldborough are that this great operatic experiment with all of you is taking place here in Maltings.
The whole apparatus of televising opera was very complicated.
I can't look at you directly in the monitor.
I think he found it a rather frustrating and slightly limiting medium, partly because he wasn't in total control himself.
I'll try and remember. No, that side is no, that's the wrong side, isn't it? No, that side is you.
There were limitations to the number of cameras and therefore the number of angles you could get. You could see that. But I felt that that released a sort of intensity. It reminded me how much you unleash creativity when you set limits.
Peter Grimes is the classic outsider, a fisherman desperately eking out a living in a tiny community, the Borough. The townsfolk suspect him of causing the death of a young apprentice. When a second apprentice also disappears, the mob rises up in judgment against him.
I think Britten is the great humane composer of the 20th century. Some of this may come out of the tension he felt as a person himself, not being quite at ease with his place in society. He's someone who cuts straight to people's heart because they can understand the personal issues of an individual isolated in respect of society.
Come on, lend me.
So these are very, very human emotions which Britten is putting on a big, wide scale, and he's doing it with such compositional skill that you're immediately drawn in.
What I find fascinating about the Peter Grimes character, and it probably is very strong in the Pears performance because he was so embedded in the role, is the match between the musical landscape and the character.
The fictional Borough was based on the Suffolk town of Aldborough, where Britten made his home for 30 years.
It's a place which is right on the edge, and it does have a terrific kind of atmosphere. It's the weather is incredibly affecting here. You have days with very low skies in which you can actually physically feel the pressure, and you have days when, you know, you can just feel the tension before the storm breaks and stuff. There's an awful lot that you can find in the music too.
Britten was born into a world that was just about to discover broadcasting. So he was a teenager in the 20s when the BBC was just beginning, and we can tell from his diaries that it was a source of real interest and real stimulus to him as a composer. And he would note in his diary, orchestra disappointingly bad, wind out of tune. And I think we can sense him being musically educated through the medium of broadcasting. And in that sense, he's a perfect example of what the BBC set out to do.
Right from the start of his career, the young Britten's own compositions had been heard on the radio. In 1939, his setting of the French poet Rimbaud's lyric about an imaginary sea, Marine, received a BBC Proms premiere at the Queen's Hall.
Amazingly, there is still a recording of this. Wonderful, wonderful, dramatic singer sings from Britten's song cycle, Les Illuminations, conducted by Henry Wood. And one can hear on the sound recording how well this comes across, and you do sense an audience that is very open and receptive to Britten's music.
In 1948, Britten founded the Aldborough Festival of Music and the Arts, here in his hometown. Using community halls and churches, he and Pears began to stage ambitious productions. The arts programme Monitor visited in 1958.
The very first job I did in television was looking at rushes of John Schlesinger's documentary about Benjamin Britten, and I helped to write the commentary for that 1958 film.
Benjamin Britten has only lived in Aldborough for the last 10 years, but he was born in Suffolk, not very far from here, and except for a short time, has always lived in this part of the world.
When you look back at John Schlesinger's film, it's amazing that he must have told Britten what to do. You know, he couldn't just grab it as we would do now. He must have told, would you mind starting walking now, Mr. Britten? Come towards the camera. Now, would you mind waiting here? Maybe you could lean back on that bollard and think for a little bit. We need to get... That kind of direction must have gone on, which is unthinkable today.
Britten belongs wholeheartedly to the community in which he lives, and his music is bound up very closely with the lives and interests around him.
The film was, in a miniature way, trying to give a portrait of the festival and also hone in on Britten's new work that year, which was Noah's Flood, which was written partly for the children of Suffolk.
He asked me to play Japhet, one of the three sons, in Noah's Flood. And it was going to be premiered in Orford Church. And I was 14, I suppose, by then, or 15. And my voice had slid down slightly. So he changed the key. And I've got the score still, and all the dots are his. He did all the transposition, and it was very exciting to try it all out. And he just spent any amount of time we needed because he was a kind man. He was generous. Everyone was so enthusiastic, and you always wanted to impress Mr. Britten, especially. And as the oldest brother, I was put up on the tiller, and I was in this storm, and the ark was going up and down, round and about. And I pulled as hard as I could to make it as dramatic as I could, and pulled, unfortunately, a little too hard and went straight off the back of the ark, legs up in the air and head over heels backwards.
I find children highly receptive, very choosy perhaps, but if they like something, and it can be music as new or as old as you like, then their reaction is spontaneous and encouraging.
It was a very moving film, and at the same time, Britten's credo that I want to write music that's useful for the community came across loud and clear.
I have a particular inclination as a composer to want to write music that is useful. And if someone asks me to do something, my inclination is to want to please them.
He would work with all the children and be encouraging. That's the best kind of teacher, especially as an introduction to classical music. You long for a teacher to make it live, to draw out of you something that you otherwise might never have discovered.
In 1960, the BBC came to the Aldborough Festival to record for the radio the premiere of Britain's new opera, based on Shakespeare's play A Midsummer Night's Dream.
The opera is, I think, one of Britain's most rich and varied achievements. He's freer in this than he has been for a long time.
The work featured 25 orchestral players and a large cast of singers, all squeezed into the tiny space of the Jubilee Hall in Aldborough.
We sometimes had to actually go out of doors to get from one side to the other entrance. So if it was raining and blowing, our makeup went all over the place. I was actually asked to sing by Ben, and that was a very great tribute for me. But she's so in love and she can't bear that he's not returning it. The pleading in the very shape of the phrase that you sing, the timing is perfect. There are little gaps, just where you need to take a breath to plead again. Working with him on a piece that had been written for me was just wonderful. Because it all sort of fitted like a glove. If I obeyed everything he wrote in the score, it sounded like me, somehow.
The critical reception for the festival performance was positive, but some listeners to the BBC Home Service had a different reaction.
The appreciation index was much lower than was standard for operas that were performed on radio at the time. In most cases, it was apparently active dislike that it was completely lacking in melody, harmony, form, beauty, or interest. A cacophony of rhythmless banging and clanging called music by someone who obviously thinks melody is below his dignity to produce.
I remember Ben saying to me one day, of course one does feel rather sad, knowing that if a piece of one's music is announced on the radio, hundreds of thousands of people lean forward and change the channel.
The 60s was the golden age of television experiment, and for 10 years, BBC programme makers were able to persuade Britain to explore a variety of ways in which his music might be presented on television.
1963 was the 50th birthday of Benjamin Britten, and I wrote to him and said, we'd like to do a programme. He said, oh, please don't. It makes me sound like an obituary at 50. Can't you wait till I'm 80? And I said, no, we want to do it now for your 50th birthday. And he gracefully acceded.
5, 4, 3.
The programme was much more ambitious than just being a documentary about his life. It was also trying to take an overview of his work.
This profile, in words, in pictures, and above all, in music, of Benjamin Britten has been put together by his admirers, those who think that in him we have a great figure living among us, and who think that today, his 50th birthday, is a perfectly sound occasion on which to say so. And we welcome to the studio his fellow composer and friend, Michael Tippett. They include music critics, and Hans Keller is with us, and Mr. Rod Stesvensky, the great Russian conductor.
I would like to wish him many, many happy returns of the day, good health, and new beautiful music.
Thank you very much.
It was very ambitious, I must say. Looking back on it, I think I managed to get it all in, but we did.
Britten at 50 managed to include an intimate portrait of Britten and Pears on their home ground. Preparing for the Attenborough Festival, relaxing together, walking the dogs.
That of all the musicians I have met, he is the one in whom music, and from whom music, flows, always, out of his mind, out of his body.
The programme contained nearly a dozen musical extracts, including Peter Grimes, Noah's Flood, and this pizzicato piece composed when Britten was only 10.
From this playful and, if I may say so, rather childish pizzicato, we turn to the real Britain.
The top A, first violin, third bar of 1. Tiam, papa, papa. Not too solemn, gentlemen. It is, after all, based on a dance.
He was not a televiewer, but at the same time, I think we persuaded him that we were on his side. And of course, that was very important, getting his confidence. He doesn't, for a moment, acknowledge or want to acknowledge the presence of the cameras. You know, if it's Andre Previn, he'd like to talk to the camera. With Britten, it's just come on and do it. The important thing is the music.
Yes. If you can just give me the feeling that you're coming to the end of a section here. There's a bit of more crescendo, the bar before 1. Ti-da-da-dum, ta-da-yam. Then we're off again, you see. 1, 2, 3, 4.
His clarity of vision in the music is clear in the way he conducts. It's not a fussy conducting on the concert, it's very straightforward. Britain at 50 ended with a sequence from the new War Requiem. When it came to planning how to put pictures to the War Requiem, I had the temerity to ring Britten and say, look, dare I ask you whether you had any images when you were composing this music? Expecting him to say, don't be silly, composers don't have pictures, they think in music. But he said, well, normally I don't have images. He said, but in this case, I would suggest to you the famous Grunewald triptych. It's a wonderful painting of Christ on the cross. So, in a sense, I had approval in a way I've never had before or since from a composer for what pictures I used to illustrate a passage of music. It's very powerful. It went out on the night that President Kennedy was assassinated. And it was somehow on that terrible day the kind of peaceful moment, reconciliation moment, when we saw the Requiem, which Britten himself had, as it were, blessed my images.
The work that made his name more than any other would have to be the War Requiem. And I think that remains perhaps the music that has the most immediate effect on people.
On the night of the 14th of November 1940, a massive aerial bombardment of Coventry and the West Midlands left hundreds dead and thousands homeless, destroying much of the city centre and leaving the cathedral a hollow, burnt-out shell. The rebuilding of the cathedral in the late 50s became a symbolic act of reconciliation and national unity. Britten composed his monumental War Requiem for the reconsecration of the building in 1962.
The War Requiem allowed Britten to project onto a public stage his private world. He didn't have to compromise on his pacifism, for example. And the piece actually dramatizes that relationship between a private grief and a public grief.
Britten was able to give the work a deeply personal dimension. 4 of his close friends had been killed as a consequence of the Second World War.
He was bitterly upset when they departed, and he thought he'd like to dedicate it to them, and also through them to all the thousands who died.
The words he chose to set interwove the traditional Latin Mass for the dead with the First World War poems of Wilfred Owen.
The amalgamation of the poems within the War Requiem itself was an inspirational idea, to mix the Latin text with these poems which are contradicting everything that's in the Requiem text.
The premiere in Coventry Cathedral quickly led to two BBC Prom performances, the first in 1963 and then this televised version a year later.
What's so brilliant about it, is that Britten is never bombastic, even though it involves so many people. It's actually one of the most intimate and personal works he ever wrote. One can only imagine, gosh, I would give anything to have been at Coventry Cathedral at that first performance, to have witnessed that.
It just transfixed us. I just stood there, my hair stood on end.
It was certainly very moving. I think that was surely one of the effects that Benjamin Britten himself would have hoped for.
I heard the first performance. I was a little bit appalled in that some people saw that piece as some kind of glorification of the memory of war. And of course, it does make war into a very profoundly moving experience without the horrible physical violence.
At the finish, I'm afraid I was in tears. I think a lot of the audience were, and that explains why there was no clapping. But it wasn't just about the destruction of the cathedral and buildings, it was the destruction of people, really, wasn't it?
These days, people take the War Requiem rather for granted. It's a part of the English wallpaper, really, English cultural landscape. But the whole thing is extremely powerful, and it's so full of tenderness. The Agnus Dei is a very simple musical scheme and a very simple word setting, and it comes out as something absolutely transcendent, partly because of the way Pears sings it. It's a simple device of going down a scale from one note and then going up another scale from the bottom note. And he runs one scale down from the F sharp and another up from the C. And he reharmonizes those two scales all the way through the piece before winding up on an F sharp major chord. It's a little tiny piece of music and just a perfect piece of clockwork as well. Now, that is a technical explanation of what is going on, and it sounds very mechanical and very simplistic and a little too neat. But the impact that this music has, particularly the way Pears sings at the end of this movement, is overwhelming.
The Prom performance of the War Requiem in 1964, which was for the anniversary of the First World War, Britain by then was an iconic national figure. And how extraordinary that is for someone who had been an outsider, was still an outsider in many ways, of course, in terms of the homosexuality, for a long time an illegal outsider. Here he is moving into absolutely the centre of our musical life.
Appearances on TV had now made Britten and Pears household names, and their frequent song recitals together revealed to audiences the composer's brilliance as a musician.
I was very proud that we got Benjamin Britten into the studio and heard his pianism, as it were, in perfect circumstances.
A flaxen-headed cowboy, as simple as may be, and next a jolly ploughboy I whistled orderly, and soon I'll be a footman and stuffed in worsted lace, and next I'll be a butler and weigh my jolly face.
The impromptuness of the way we shot it was part of the style of the whole recital. The recital sounds rather pompous. This was pullover time, and Ben and Peter very relaxed.
So great a man I'll be, so great a man, so great a man, so great a man I'll be. You forget the little ploughboy that whistled orderly.
Ben didn't say a word, but he played magnificently.
When Dudley Moore did those wonderful parodies of Britten at the piano, which of course was made sense to people because they'd seen Ben and Peter in their double act on television quite regularly. That was so familiar to people that Dudley Moore could get the laughs. Their responses to it, which of course were very separate, perhaps tell us something about the characters. Peter was amused by it, whereas Ben, I think, took it in rather bad part, didn't exactly think it was the right thing to do.
Stand by for a take, please.
Turn them over sound.
Classical music on television never had it so good as it did when BBC Two arrived. I joined it in 1965, just before its first birthday, and did my best to develop specialisms that BBC One didn't. And one of those things was classical music.
In 1966, the BBC mounted an ambitious studio production of the all-male opera Billy Budd. Adapted from Herman Melville's unfinished novella, it had first been performed on the stage of the Royal Opera House in 1951. Now shot as a drama at Television Centre, Peter Pears sang the role of the ship's captain, Vere. Michael Langdon was the sadistic master-at-arms, Claggart. And Peter Glossop sang the title character.
Your name, Billy Budd, sir. Your age, don't know, sir. Don't know, your trade, able seaman. Can you read? No, but I can sing. Never mind the singing.
What we wished to do was not to produce a theatrical experience in the sense of that you were looking at a proscenium stage, but that it would be an opera in which the viewer was really involved in the same way as he was in a drama. And the results were stunning.
Mr. Boatswain! Mr. Boatswain! Yes, sir! Heads the bracers, man the yards! Hey, sir!
I think with Billy Budd, which is the biggest orchestra in any opera he ever used, there is an incredible tang to the sound. You can feel the brine, you can feel the salt everywhere.
Top down there and strong, strong! Top down the sports, eyes on day! Can't tell you no, men, life's not to play upon a man of war. Cocky young bastards, send them back to
I find the breadth of the language, the musical language in Billy Budd, extraordinary. The build-up in the orchestra in the first act until this enormous sea shanty can be heard and sung off stage by all these sailors. Really very overwhelming. Despite the fact that the action is extremely claustrophobic, the music has a bigness and an opulence and a generosity to it, which is pretty unique in his output.
I really did not know at that point whether the idea of writing a large-scale opera with a cast only of men, which had not been done before, whether that would be suitable. But Britten loved this particular story. It represents a world very much impoverished because one lacks a dimension of human experience in the relationship between man and woman.
I teach you anything right here. Squeak! Yes, sir. Take this man away and list him for 20 strokes. See, it's done at once. Yes, sir.
But it was so fundamentally a part of his character, of his creativity, that it was no good anyone saying to him, although I thought this, you would be a greater composer if, like your heroes, Mozart, like Verdi, your world was all-embracing. He felt the world was against him and restricted him and narrowed him down in that choice, I guess.
Eric Crozier's fellow librettist for Billy Budd was the novelist E.M. Forster.
Melville, after the initial roughness of his realism, reaches straight back into the universal, to a blackness and sadness so transcending our own that they are undistinguishable from glory.
It seems to me the kind of subject that would attract a composer by the quality of extension from the story, that you start with real human characters which are then extended onto other planes of significance. Ben, do you think that's true?
Yes, I'm slightly out of my depth here, honestly, because when I start writing, I always start from the characters themselves and the conflicts between the characters. What you've been talking about, Eric, I hope comes in accidentally. If I'm any good as a composer, the music will show a greater depth than perhaps I'm intending.
An example of that, I think, is Claggart's aria, oh beauty, oh handsomeness, oh goodness.
Handsomeness, goodness, oh, that I never seen you, oh, that I never...
Claggart's monologue is perhaps the one case in Billy Budd where the character gets, as it were, outside himself and sings about himself.
Having seen you, a choice remains to me. I am doomed to annihilate you. I vow to your destruction.
From a technical point of view, Britten's scores are nothing short of miraculous, really. I mean, you need an incredible mind to put those things together.
I am the messenger of death.
There's this astonishing moment where the captain goes into the cabin to tell Billy Budd the verdict of the court, and he's going to be hanged. And Britten then plays simply a succession of common chords with the notes of the F major chord at the top, so you don't hear them all as being in the same key at all.
The conductor for the BBC's 1966 studio production wasn't Britten himself, but Charles Mackerras.
It was quite difficult because in those days we had the orchestra in one studio and the action went on in another. And in the Billy Budd, we had two choristers, one that sang with the orchestra and looked at the music, and the other that was doing the action. The reason he didn't conduct that television performance was because he didn't think he could do it. keeping the two choruses together. He was around the whole time, which made us all rather nervous because he really insisted on having it exactly his way. The end was a bit of a nightmare because we were running out of time. Peter Glossop, who was doing Billy Budd, kept marching to the scaffold and then getting the wrong note. Starry Veer, God bless you, you know. And my assistant, David Lloyd-Jones, had to stand next to him invisibly and hum the note to him so that he got the right note.
Starry Veer, God bless you.
The transmission of Billy Budd had a huge impact on audiences and critics alike, captured on that same evening's edition of BBC Two's Late Night Lineup.
This is from the Daily Mail, Peter Black's column. He says Cedric Bassina's production of Billy Budd translated the full impact of Britten's opera, which can be likened to a fist which clenches the separate components of music, action, singing, words and atmosphere so tightly that they cannot be prized apart. And a last word from Richard Last of The Sun. A production of Benjamin Britten's Billy Budd, shown last night, that's tonight, is beyond doubt the finest achievement in television opera yet mounted in this country. Almost for the first time, genuinely cinematic treatment has been brought to bear on the problem of translating opera to the small screen.
In 1967, BBC Two transmitted Tony Palmer and Humphrey Burton's film about the gramophone recording of Britain's burning fiery furnace in the Suffolk village of Orford.
I can remember the excitement of working so close to Benjamin Britten and feeling, you know, they're making history, but we're recording it, and it's such a privilege, really. So we're able to watch Britten rehearsing, working with singers and conducting, and also working with the Decca recording engineers.
The record producer was John Culshaw, pioneer in stereo recording.
What would you like? We have time to go on and then do, if you like, the whole thing again, or would you like to concentrate on this first?
I would rather like to get this one absolutely firmly in the bag.
I think our herald, his intonation was a bit wild, and in his first royal command, great
Yes.
King of Kings.
How was Peter in the 14? Was that all right?
Very good, I think.
Like Noah's flood, the burning fiery furnace is what Britten called a church parable.
Stand by, trombone, Gordon.
The Old Testament story of three scholars, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, who by divine intervention are saved from being burned alive. Peter Pears sang the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar.
You shall be cast at once into the burning fiery furnace.
These sessions showed a side of Britain that was rarely seen on film. Confident, relaxed with a team that he trusted.
He was scared stiff before we started that somehow the noise of the cameras would get in the way, but they were so busy doing their production that they didn't have time to worry about us.
Get the triplet on the beat. That's the important.
You see him really flat out, and he's healthy and he's still on top of his game, and it's very exciting.
I think that was his great skill, to get across the absolutely motivating force behind his music, and he is always determined to draw the best from his performers.
Now, please, we want to start off with a balance.
When you watch Britten conducting, there's an extraordinary combination of absolute technical control and great calm, but under it you sense an absolutely bubbling energy.
There had to be in it a march around the church, and he hadn't worked out what to do with the bass player, and he said, I wonder if we should put him on roller skates. I remember that. But eventually the bass player marches around with a big so-called Babylonian drum.
Between takes, Britten comes round to the control room with me to listen to the playbacks. They are, of course, enormously useful for hearing mistakes. He's very quick at spotting our mistakes.
Britain's playing shouldn't be playing. But Neil goes on regardless. Now everyone stops.
He didn't like discussing the technicalities of music unless he wanted to know something. I mean, for instance, the percussion player, James Blades, he would have long discussions about percussion technique, but he didn't want to talk about his own music if he could help it.
These are genuine pieces from China. Perhaps the camera will oblige by focusing, and you can see the dragon, the 5 Chinese drums. Yes, but Mr. Britten said I shall want more than that, several sorts of sound. But he said I want something harder. He said, would you try using thimbles? I said, most certainly, Mr. Britten. You never know what to expect from Mr. Britten.
His fertile working relationship with the BBC also allowed Britten to share with audiences some of his own favourite composers, particularly Mozart.
There is a marvellous moment of Britten and Richter playing the 2-piano Mozart sonata together in a sort of competition for who can play it faster in the last movement, which is really exhilarating. He obviously had that completely instinctive understanding of the instrument, the way to use it. He never makes an ugly sound, but he always makes a penetrating, lyrical, beautiful sound. Mozart was one of the people who Britten felt absolutely closest to through his composing life. And I think that you can see where the links are there. They are in beauty of form, absolute command of structure, but within that beauty, a real fierceness and a real impact.
E Domino is the only opera he conducted not composed by himself. At that time, E Domino wasn't done that much. It was rather splendid. There was even a monster. It was a Britten version, in a sense, that there were quite a few cuts, one or two even rewritings. And he rewrote, for instance, the passage for 4 horns when the oracle turned up, took out the trombones and reorchestrated that bit. But you wouldn't really know, unless you know it very well. You wouldn't realise what had happened.
For Britten, Idomeneo proved to be one of the happiest of all his TV experiences.
He was conducting his beloved Mozart, whom he revered above everybody, Probably because he was very similar in way. I mean, there were a lot of similarities between him and Mozart. Benjamin Britten was perfectly clearly one of the great composers Britain had, if not the greatest. And the BBC was constantly trying to, I was going to say court him, and in a way we were, because it would be a great feather in our caps if we could commission an opera.
I looked around among all the stories that I could think of immediately for a story which would be most suitable to the medium television.
This was to be something special, a Benjamin Britten opera conceived for the camera. He chose Owen Wingrave, a Henry James short story in which a young cadet refuses to fight, rejecting his family military tradition, and ultimately dies for his beliefs.
The main reason that he took the commission on was because it gave a huge audience to pacifism, which he felt very strongly.
There was a lot of talk about how he would use the potential of television to produce ghostly effects, because it is in effect a ghost story.
What was most attractive to me in this story was this bombshell which arrived in the middle of this family would give a marvelous opportunity to show each person's individual reactions to the bombshell.
Inevitably, Britten insisted that the whole opera must be shot in Suffolk, at Snape Maltings.
We had to build, effectively, a completely new studio, which was equipped with outside broadcast units. So it was very much a lash-up.
The biggest difficulty is literally squeezing everything into a hall, which isn't a television studio.
The Maltings was transformed into layers of different sets.
Squeezing in a large, almost 50-piece orchestra.
The orchestra was sort of halfway up on a great rostrum, and everything had to be done through monitors. Highly complex and full of all kinds of pitfalls. And I went down there during the production, and the atmosphere was electric. The tension was huge, and Britten himself was extremely tense. And there was one time when there wasn't a monitor in the right place, and there was a terrific shindy. And eventually they hoisted one into position, and Britten says, "Now we can get on with this bloody opera."
Every single singer in that cast was really, I feel, the ideal one. Each one of them being associated with quite a few of my operas. Well, it was just, I don't know what I did to deserve it, frankly.
The part of Owen Wingrave was sung by the Cornish baritone Benjamin Luxon.
I have found my image, I have found myself. In peace I rejoice amongst men, and yet walk alone.
He's not the most complex character. There's a very young man who worked out for himself that he cannot stand the business of war and glory and all the hypocrisy that goes with it, and that he suddenly makes up his mind that he won't have anything to do with it.
For peace is not lazy, but vigilant.
It was very relevant. Pacifist theme was, there was time of the Vietnam War, and Britain was very keen to get that message across. And I think it's very clear.
Peace is not me, but strong like the bird's wing.
Nigel Douglas sang the tenor role of Lechmere, Owen's fellow student.
Lechmere was a wildly enthusiastic young puppy who couldn't wait to get at the enemy. He takes a sword down from the wall and he says, "You beauty."
Ah, you beauty, how many vile heads, vile foreign heads, have you rolled into the dust? You great choice in violence. What is the enemy for but to be routed and killed? You forget you are the enemy too.
I won't pretend that it went without technical difficulties. We had things like the dinner party scene, which was tricky.
The head of the family, Sir Philip, was sung by Peter Pears.
It was always extremely amusing working with Peter because it was a well-known fact that he had trouble with his memory.
Quite near the end of the dinner scene, there's that passage which goes, pistols, sharpers, lots of weapons were mentioned, and he could never get them in the right order.
Out would come dagbirds and halgers and all sorts of things.
And I used to stand behind the camera going, pistols, dagger, halberds and all that, try to mime exactly what weapon he was supposed to see.
Halberds, pistols, daggers or their company, lances, sword thrusts, parted them from line.
And they could see me doing this, and everybody around the table used to get giggles. Britain was conducting away oblivious of all this.
Owen Wingrave took 9 days to film, and it found the 57-year-old composer at the apex of his creativity.
It was the first orchestral score Britain had written for over 10 years, and I think it unleashed something new in him.
He could create a very complex world without actually covering the page with millions of notes. There are very few times when the whole orchestra is playing, but where Owen Wingrave goes into the haunted room and he tells his lady friend Kate to turn the key, and at that point the orchestra is playing for 1 millisecond altogether.
Turn your key.
And you realise how much has been held back for that one moment.
In the end, I personally don't feel it's one of Britain's most successful operas, but it is one that fits very well the medium of television.
He didn't have a television himself. His television was specially bought for him when Owen Wingrave was broadcast, so he could actually watch it.
BBC Two ultimately showed the finished 1 3/4 hour opera on Sunday the 16th of May, 1971.
Owen Wingrave can still pack a punch, but there seems to have been a falling off in the 70s of Britain's work with the BBC. I think that was largely due to his health. And then suddenly he was gone, and I remember 3 days, 2 nights of working on the obituary, which we put together.
Benjamin Britten died on the 4th of December 1976. 3 days later, he was buried at Aldborough Parish Church.
It reflects well on the BBC, I think, that we were able to find ways of serving him, recognising that he was a truly great figure in our lives.
Spellbinding performances of classical music and so much more. There's something for everyone at the BBC Proms. Listen and enjoy on BBC Sounds.